This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. We have finally made it to 2021. I can't say that I am disappointed to see 2020 in the rearview mirror. This doesn't mean that we will miraculously solve all of our problems overnight, but it is a nice mental marker to move forward, to have some new hope. I want to begin by giving some thanks. I want to thank my ongoing supporters, Libby N., James T., John G., and Joel W. I also want to thank new raters and reviewers, GGM. I won't be able to pronounce this username, but begins with JSG, and another user whom I will call DD. Thank you for the ratings and reviews. Thank you for the support of the podcast. I'm going to talk a little bit about my upcoming plans for the 2021 year for the podcast, improvements that I'd like to make. So please hang on in the final thoughts area of the episode, and I will go over some of those plans. In the meantime, I will ask that you do, in fact, rate and review the podcast. And one other request is, an ongoing goal is to rise in the Google results for various keywords. The podcast has been number one for the term secular grace for quite some time, and it just recently has started to rise in the ranks for the term deconversion. So if you could do me a favor and just Google deconversion and click on my link, which is probably about the fourth, fifth link in the list, that will help rise in those rankings. The podcast is all about secular grace and deconversion, so I'm hoping that people will find the podcast by Googling those terms. On to today's show. My guest today is John Steingard, the lead singer and guitarist for Hawk Nelson. Several months ago, John posted on Instagram a heart-wrenching revelation that he no longer believed in God, that he could no longer call himself a Christian. As you can imagine, someone who is famous within the Christian music world and famous just in the Christian world, this was a dramatic moment. The number of hot takes that I have read from apologists about John's deconversion are innumerable. I've talked about them on the Still Unbelievable podcast with Matthew Taylor and Andrew Knight. John has since gone on what I would call a podcast and YouTube world tour. He has talked to multiple apologists. He's been on multiple humanist and atheist podcasts. And he has such a down-to-earth way of talking about his seeking for truth, because really this isn't about atheism or anything else. He wants to know what is true. And so he is honest about that process. Since the recording of this podcast about a month ago, John has started his own podcast and YouTube channel called The Wonder and the Mystery of Being. There will be links in the show notes for these, and I highly recommend that you go and check that out. Here is my conversation with John Steingard. John Steingard, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
David, thanks for having me, man.
This is one of those fun times where everyone knows who you are and nobody knows who I am. So me introducing you is just a ridiculous thing. But you are the lead singer and guitarist for Hawk Nelson.
Yep.
And the reason you're on the show today is that a few months ago, you posted an Instagram post talking about your deconstruction process.
That's right.
Let's just start with, how difficult was it to write that message?
You know, on one hand, it was like one of the most difficult things I ever feel like I wrote down. But on the other hand, it was so liberating to feel like I could finally say what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Because it had been such a process of feeling a lot of those things and thinking a lot of those thoughts and learning and processing, you know, things to do with my faith and having to feel like I couldn't say that stuff out loud.
Right.
so it was difficult to write down, but it was also liberating. And you know, I'm sure anyone that's gone through that process identifies with that sort of dualistic experience where it's amazing and horrifying all at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
So I reread it this morning just in preparation to chat with you, and just the feeling of being torn between being authentic and honest and straightforward, and also knowing that this was a bomb that was going to go off in the community, and
Yeah.
you know, people who love you. What was the reaction? What was the main reaction to this?
Yeah, I mean, for me, anybody that knows me personally was incredibly kind.
Yeah.
With almost no exceptions. I mean, I can think of a couple now that I really actually think about it, but
You definitely find who your friends are.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
with virtually no exceptions, I had people reaching out and saying that they loved me and that they, you know, that we're still friends. You know, these are all, I mean, almost the vast majority of my friends were Christian and still are.
Right.
And I also, for anyone that I was pretty close to, I gave them a heads up. So like that morning before I posted, I texted probably, you know, 35 people or so saying like, hey, I just wanted you to hear from me. This is what I'm posting today. Obviously, it's a big deal in my life. And I just want you to know that, like, I love you. I don't want this to change the fact that we're friends, but I recognize it'll also change the dynamic. And I just wanted you to hear it from me and not see it on Instagram.
Right.
So I did that, and I think that helped. And for the vast majority of people that know me personally, they were very kind. Of course, then you get strangers on the internet.
Right.
And the response there was as mixed as you would expect. You know,
Yes.
Some people were also kind. Other people were sad. Some people were downright hateful. You know, then I had, you know, atheists and Christians fighting in the comments about theology, which was always fun.
Yeah.
It was a bit of everything, you know, online.
So I've been following your story pretty much since you posted that. And one of the things I've been fascinated by is you've really made yourself available. So you've been on the Unbelievable podcast. You've talked to Sean McDowell. You've talked to Jonathan McClatchy, and you've just really been open, and I think you've gone above and beyond. Honestly, you've really made yourself available to answer those questions. What has it been like talking to professional apologists?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, first off, I think most of the believers that, you know, like Sean and Jonathan and Frank Turek, I did a thing with him as well. They've all been incredibly kind, and they all have their own tone and their own approach to the way they do things publicly, and that's normal and cool. But I never felt like any of them came at me in a argumentative or overly aggressive way.
Yeah.
It was always from the perspective of like, hey, this is someone who was one of us and is now, you know, saying that he's not, and I just hope that he has all the information before he makes that decision. That's sort of been the approach that most of them have taken. And I appreciate that. And for me, I've chosen to engage with those people because I am interested in the truth. And I don't want to, you know, walk away from Christianity out of ignorance. I don't want to stay in ignorance, and I don't want to walk out of ignorance, you know? So I should be open to truth wherever I find it, and that should include the circles that I come from. So that's been why I've been, you know, making myself available, as you say. I actually feel like there's a bit of a lack in my engagement with individuals from other religions, and so that's something I'd like to remedy at some point, and maybe do some stuff on my own YouTube channel, and maybe have some conversations with Muslims, with Buddhists, with Hindu individuals. And so that's something I'd like to do more in the future. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. I think the reason that I say that you've gone above and beyond is, from my perspective, the work that I'm doing, I feel like adult deconversions like yourself, like me, really says something, right? Like there's a difference between you're 20 years old, you're in college, and, you know, you're reading Nietzsche and you reject your, you know,
I do like Nietzsche.
Yeah, exactly. You specifically, you had an entire career that was
Yeah.
predicated upon your belief system. For you to go through the process of deconstruction and then be willing to let go, at least on some level, of some financial security, that's a pretty big deal. And one of the things I find interesting from the apologetic response, and here I do want to separate the difference between believers, just regular people,
Yep.
and the professional apologetic class.
Sure.
But there is almost an assumption like, well, you probably haven't looked at it from this perspective, or you haven't looked at it from that perspective, or maybe you didn't have faith in the right way.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel kind of being patronized?
Not from like the guys that you mentioned, like Sean and Jonathan and Dr. Turek. I don't feel like they were ever patronizing. I feel like they're so used to engaging with people that are not believers that they've learned the skill of being respectful and non-patronizing. Now, there's certainly other people that have been a little bit more patronizing. I remember, at one point I wrote an Instagram post listing all the crazy things that people have suggested are the cause of my conversion,
right?
Or my deconversion, right?
Yes.
And like one of them, I had forgotten about that post, and someone brought it up to me the other day. And like one of them was low carb diet. So like that's one of the more ridiculous ones. But it's like I said before, it's like any of those kinds of patronizing things, they're all coming from people that don't know me. And, one of the advantages I have compared to someone who's maybe not used to being in the public sphere is that I've got 15 years of experience ignoring random people on the internet,
Right.
So it's just, I've gotten a pretty thick skin on that level. And so it doesn't, if someone that knows me personally is patronizing or rude or hateful to me, that actually does hurt my feelings. But if someone, a random person online who doesn't know me personally, it's very easy for me to look at that and go like, well, they just don't know me. That's okay. Yeah.
Right. I wanted to mention, I think the thing that made me love you, Brian Houston of Hillsong wrote a tweet and he said,
yeah, that one got under my skin.
When someone can just walk away from their faith, I would question the strength and validity of their faith in the first place. And your response was just beautiful. Or you could just love them. And I think that encapsulates so much of what I think is wrong in the dialogue between deconverts and believers is, I'll talk about, if you're a religious humanist, in other words, if you care about people, the well-being of human beings, and I'm a secular humanist, hey, we can do some stuff together. We can make an impact on the world instead of trying to undermine each other's justifications for why we care about people. That just seems like a ridiculous waste of time to me.
Well, it's like if we can agree that we care about people, like let's focus on that. Let's
exactly.
focus on I'm with you.
Yeah. So I think that post alone told me quite a bit about your character and your heart. I know part of your story is going to, I believe it's Uganda.
Yeah,
Can you talk about that story a little bit, about how that impacted you?
Yeah. So over the years of doing the band, I started, when you're in a band, first off, you have, we play shows every night, and when you're on tour in the spring and the fall, you typically get on a tour bus and you go from city to city, and you have a lot of time during the day. And so I started using that time learning how to operate cameras and do video production.
Okay.
And initially I did that because the band needed, video content, and I was starting to make it, but then that grew into a full-on video business, and that's actually what I do full-time now. And one of the projects I did a couple of years ago was a documentary in Uganda about a people group named the Batwa. And the Batwa live in southwestern Uganda, kind of tucked in that corner right next to Rwanda and the Congo. And they were, for generations, just a hunter-gatherer society, like super old school, undeveloped. This is very, very remote. And they lived in this area of the Virunga Mountains, and they just lived off the land. And in the 90s, the Ugandan government decided to create a gorilla sanctuary there. And as far as conservation of the environment goes, that's a good thing. And as tourism, that's a good thing. And business, that's a good thing. But the one problem was they had to clear the Batwa out. And when they did that, they didn't really offer the Batwa any sort of place to go or any solutions as to, we're moving these people from their ancestral homelands and then just kicking them out and not giving them any compensation or any options. And so they just became this lost people that had nowhere to go. They didn't fit into society at all. They're physically different than the other natives in the area. They're pygmies, so they're less than 5 feet tall. So it's very easy to distinguish them physically. So it's easy to discriminate against them if you want to.
Okay.
And so the organization I went with basically works with this people group, and there's a lot of orphans. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of starvation. There's a lot of disease. They're incredibly impoverished, and they're basically just squatting on whatever land they can find. So this organization that I went with, they have an orphanage that houses, feeds, and clothes and educates 250 Batwa children. And before they got there, over half the children born in these little encampments would not make it to the age of 5. Anyway, sorry, this is getting to be not the short version of this story, but
that's okay.
Essentially, I went there to document their story because that hadn't really been fully done the way that it needed to be for this organization. And so I went and did that. And I had recently become a father myself. And so I'm looking at these Batwa children and I see my son. And I just can't help but think, this could be my son if he was just born here instead of in, San Diego where we live. And to see children starving, to see them not making it to the age of 5, to see, the image that actually really, well, there's 2 images that really broke me. One of them was the descriptions of how they would find these children was typically they would find them because they just find a random child in the forest somewhere, naked and starving and alone.
Wow.
Because their parent had died while they were just sort of hiding in the forest, and the child was left on their own. That's how they found a lot of these kids, and that's horrifying to me. The description is like they would find these kids by following the sound of them crying.
Oh.
Like, wrecked me.
Yeah.
And then the other image that wrecked me was at one point I was taking a few shots with this really long lens because I was trying to not insert myself into the story too much. I was trying to just really pick off little micro stories that I could see visually happening in these encampments. And at one point I saw what looked to be about a 4-year-old girl who was caring for a 2-year-old boy. And I realized in that moment, that 4-year-old is actually responsible for this 2-year-old the way that I am responsible for my son.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm watching a 4-year-old raise a 2-year-old because that's the only option they have.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff just wrecked me. And I was already starting to sort of question a lot of things about my faith, but that put me in a place where I was like, the things that I'm seeing here do not dovetail with the idea of an all-powerful and all-loving God. Because when I read scripture, when I listen to what I hear in Christian culture, I hear about a God who intervenes.
Yeah.
I hear about a God who answers prayer. Certainly not always, but definitely sometimes. And I grew up hearing stories of people that were like, God he loves me so much. He answers even my tiny little prayers sometimes. I pulled into church one day and I was late and I didn't think I was going to get a parking spot. And then bam, right up front, there was a parking spot. And I knew just God loves me so much. He even cares about those little details. And so I grew up hearing that. And then I go to Uganda and I see this.
Yeah.
And I go God, maybe answer a few less parking spot prayers and a few more prayers for these children who are literally dying.
Yeah.
And suffering unimaginably. And in situations where honestly, sometimes dying is the most merciful thing they could experience because they're suffering so much. And I came back from that trip, and I was just like, there's no way that I can believe in God the way that I used to after that. No way.
Yeah.
And then I started reading about the problem of suffering or the problem of evil in a more philosophical sense, but I experienced it in that way sort of before I really dug into it intellectually. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to be careful that we're not exploitive of the story of the Batwa as well here, but I've listened to several of your conversations with various people about the problem of evil, and they are definitely trying to answer it from a more philosophical point of view. But when you have experienced starving children, those pat answers just aren't adequate. They don't rise to the level of the real world problems that you can see.
Yeah, the way I describe it to them is I usually say something along the lines of like, I understand the philosophical sort of responses to the problem of evil, but when I'm standing there in Uganda with these children, those answers are not satisfying. And to their credit, a lot of the apologists that I've spoken with are quick to say, like, yeah, the problem of evil is probably the biggest issue. It's probably the biggest argument against the existence of a loving God. And they're usually pretty quick to say that that's the case.
Sure.
Yeah.
We're also kind of dancing around the divine hiddenness problem as well.
And for a long time, I actually thought that the problem of evil was my main problem. And it wasn't until I thought about it more that divine hiddenness sort of revealed itself to me. Divine hiddenness revealed itself to me. But I realized that divine hiddenness was actually the big issue for me.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that I try to get across is that, and again, I want to really separate, if there are believers listening, it's not believers that I'm talking about, it's the apologetic perspective.
Sure.
Is that the apologetic perspective has a neutered God, a powerless God that fits nicely in a box. And there are answers for every reason why the answer is no, right?
Yeah.
I believe that your experience of your faith tradition was one of charismatic experience. And
yeah, very much.
I think your faith was of a powerful interventionist God. And then when you go again to the real world in Uganda and God is not intervening, these are reasonable questions to ask.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's unreasonable not to ask them, in my view,
Right. Exactly.
And I think I spent a lot of years not asking them out of fear of what the answers might be, because I was someone, like you hinted at earlier, my career and my livelihood was wrapped up in my belief. And so in a sense, I was like a professional Christian.
Right.
The same way that an apologetic author is sort of a professional Christian.
Right.
I was as well. The only difference is that when I was a teenager and I got into being in bands, I didn't realize that's where I was headed. Right. Like I just didn't think about it that way. Like,
yeah,
I accepted my Christianity. It's what I was raised in. I accepted my, my beliefs. I hadn't really studied it the way that I've studied now, but I was ensconced in this culture. And my career was a part of that, and questioning it would have meant undermining my career. And so for a long time, I just didn't. And it's not that, sometimes I've been accused of like, oh, well, you didn't believe for a long time and you just lied. And I'm like, well, no, I really did believe. And I had questions, but I was afraid to even ask them like alone by myself. I was afraid to present them to myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of a nuanced thing. And I guess if someone wants to argue that I was being duplicitous, they can do that. But I don't feel that I was.
Well, I completely understand what you're saying. Our mutual friends from Still Unbelievable, Matthew Taylor and Andrew Knight, Matthew has this beautiful way of saying that, his deconversion, he was aware of it suddenly, but the suddenly didn't describe the deconversion process. It just described his awareness.
Yeah. And I would relate to that tremendously. Yeah.
So I feel the same way that, it was, years of change going on under the hood, and then a moment of honesty, of admitting to myself, I don't believe.
Do you remember where you were when you first said out loud, Like, I don't think I believe in God.
Yeah. I literally said, "Oh shit."
Yeah.
I don't believe anymore. And because my immediate response was, how am I going to tell my wife? So my wife is very much a believer, and
Is she still?
absolutely, she absolutely
Yeah.
is. And in fact, we've got an episode that will probably precede yours of she and I talking together and
Wow.
working through some of this. So again, back to that idea of she's a better humanist than I am. She's just a believer and a humanist, right? Like she loves people. She cares about meeting real world needs in the world. And we share so many values still. And that's kind of what we've been able to focus on and move
That's
forward
amazing,
with.
because that's a hard journey. I've spoken to, I mean, one of the really cool things that I've gotten to do the last 8 months or so is talk with people that are also on similar journeys to mine,
Right.
who maybe didn't have people to talk to about it before.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in Instagram DMs, I've spent obscene amounts of time this year just talking with people about this stuff. And so many people like yourself are in a marriage where there's a difference of, perspective on this stuff. And that is incredibly difficult. So
Yeah.
the fact that you guys have managed to work through that, I mean, at least to the degree that you have, that's incredible. That's awesome.
Yeah. And that's mostly a testament to my wife. So, but since you bring it up, your Instagram post mentions your wife, and it sounds like the two of you went through this process kind of together. What was that like? Which one of you admitted it first to the other?
Definitely I went first, but we got very, very lucky that we have similar backgrounds. I mean, similar, almost identical. I mean, I grew up in Canada. She grew up here in California. But other than that, our backgrounds are like strangely identical. So
Okay, yeah.
Both of our dads are pastors. Both of our dads are pastors of very charismatic churches. Both of our dads' churches had a history of church splits and disagreements within the church that sort of happened at very critical times in our upbringing that caused some baggage for sure. So my wife and I have very similar baggage when it comes to Christianity. And both of us sort of just didn't really want to fully admit that maybe we didn't believe for quite some time. But once I started going down that path, my wife was like, everything you're saying is confirming stuff that I think I've felt for a really long time. So it's been awesome in the sense that we've been on more or less the same page this whole time, which is really, really fantastic. It's been one less issue to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, like, there's a sadness there. And maybe, I don't know if maybe you have had this experience, but, for me, a lot of this journey, and my wife really feels this a lot, is that we used to have this sense of certainty. And I now, we both now see that certainty wasn't necessarily based on truth,
right?
But it was based, it was based on a lot of assumptions. But regardless, we've still lost that certainty, and so there's a lot of things about life and death and the future and the sort of metaphysical nature of reality that we used to think we understood, and now we recognize that we might not know the first thing about.
Right.
How we raise our kids, those kinds of things.
Purpose and meaning.
Yeah, purpose and meaning, like the age-old question of like, what is the purpose of our lives? Why are we here? What are we doing here?
We can talk about this more, but like for me, I think the recognition that I came to was there may not be inherent purpose and meaning in the universe.
Yeah.
But human beings are meaning makers.
Yes.
And in some ways, we are so good at making meaning that we created gods, right? Like it's kind of out of that impetus that makes that.
That's a really interesting way to say it. And I think that's bang on. Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to talk to a few of my kind of humanist heroes. Sasha Sagan wrote a book called For Small Creatures Such as We that talks a lot about this.
Well, that's a good title.
Yeah. It's from Carl Sagan, so her dad. Bart Campolo similar. And I always talk, when I'm talking to them, it's like, how can we bottle up this sense of joy and humility from a secular perspective and give it away? And I find that is the hardest thing to do, right? Like, I don't know how to, I know how I feel it and I can talk about it and express it, but I don't know how to give it away yet.
Yeah. It's difficult because it's like, in a lot of ways, like, think about the word good, or the color yellow. Like, how do you describe the color yellow to someone? It's just like, you have to just say yellow and trust that the person you're talking to knows what you're talking about. And I sort of think that finding meaning outside of religion of any kind is something like that. It's like, there are things that feel meaningful to me, but I no longer exactly have a way to articulate why. Or I can try, but it just sort of like, it's not satisfying in the same way that, the apologetic explanations for the problem of evil are not satisfying. Right. Like I have some guesses as to why my bond with my children is so strong. And those have to do with evolution and genetics and sociology and all that stuff. But like, explaining it like that doesn't seem to do it justice.
Yeah.
So that's one of the areas that I continue to find myself curious. And I continue to find myself wanting to use religious language. Like when I spend time with my son, something about that feels sacred to me.
Yeah.
And so it's a question of like, well, what does that mean? Right? And like, so I feel you on that stuff.
I think you're asking all the right questions. Again, I don't want to make this about me, but very quickly,
please, I want to hear more.
One of the answers for me is the recognition that, from the apologetic point of view, they are trying to say we have this absolute justification. Mm-hmm. And in truth, an honest perspective is that really they are asserting that God exists and everything falls out from that.
Yeah.
And so I just basically lean into that and say, okay, I assert that human beings have great value and that our connection to one another is the greatest meaning in my life.
Right.
I just assert it and let what happens out of that fall out of that.
Right.
And it leads to really good things, right? Like, I think part of your story was being able to embrace the LGBTQ community. Are you a human being? Great.
Yeah.
You deserve rights and dignity and kindness and love and respect. And it just simplifies a lot of things, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't think that issues pertaining to the LGBTQ community, I did not think that was central to my journey until recently. Mm. And I realized that it actually has been.
Yeah.
The feeling of freedom to go like, you know what? I can affirm everybody everywhere. And it doesn't mean I have to affirm every action every human being takes.
Yes.
But I can affirm them as a human being.
Yeah.
And it's been an absolute joy to be able to say stuff like that publicly. And in my heart, like in my gut, I've wanted to be more openly affirming of same-sex marriage, of, transgender individuals. In this journey since talking about it publicly, I actually had a dear friend come out to me privately. Mm. And he's not out at the moment, but he was comfortable sharing that part of himself with me once I started talking about this publicly.
Right.
And I was just like, what a joy what an honor that I get to be a part of, this person's life who I've known for a long time. And they're being transparent and open with me and wanting to share something about themselves with me because they know they can trust me.
Right.
And what a joy that's been.
Yeah.
It's been way more central to my journey than I thought it was.
What I find interesting is that I think what compelled me to Christianity to begin with, I became a Christian in my late teens.
Oh, okay.
Was the humanity of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Was the compassion, the calling out of hypocrisy, the loving the people who were unlovable, right?
Yeah.
That's what drew me to that. And then it was that same desire to care about people that kind of led me out to recognize that this is actually limiting my ability to care for people rather than expanding upon it. And so that is one of the unexpected surprises of deconstruction, deconversion is that, you're just free to care about people.
Yeah. And, I've thought about this a lot now. And I really love, I love thinking about it in that way, because I do feel like Christianity tracks with humanism on a lot of levels.
Right.
But there's just a few issues where it feels like it departs. And those issues become a problem, when you're dealing, you're just walking through life. You find yourself, if you're someone who deeply cares about people, you find yourself like wanting to love people and affirm people more than your faith really allows you to. And those are the issues. Like, one of the things that I'm doing this sort of privately with friends, because I don't feel like I'm like prepared to do it in a organized public way yet. But I actually feel like you can make a really good case for being affirming of the LGBTQ community, even if you are a Bible believing, Christian. I think you can make a really good case for it. And so one of the things I've enjoyed doing with my Christian friends is saying, hey, I've seen how you love people. I know you love people. And I think that you would be open to the idea of being affirming to this community if you felt like it was consistent with your faith. And here's a way that I think you can do that.
Right.
And that's been fun for me, because it's like, it's not adversarial then. Because it's like, I'm going like, hey, I know that you love people. I've seen you do it. And here's a way that I think you can do it even more. And I think you want to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I want to go back to the early moments of kind of admitting to yourself that you no longer believed. Who did you tell first? So besides your wife, who was the first person outside of your immediate family that you told?
It's kind of hard to say, because it happened in stages for me. Like, I think I gradually disbelieved in things one at a time. Mm-hmm. So, I think one of the things that I gave up before I gave up belief in God was biblical inerrancy. Mm-hmm. And I got to a point where I was just like, there is no way I can continue to believe that the Bible is the perfect word of God.
Right.
And there's a lot of reasons for that. And some of them are simple, some of them are technical. But, I had a lot of those conversations with my dad, who's a pastor, and my wife's dad, who's also a pastor. And then I had a number of close friends that are either friends that I have from Christian music or friends that I have from the film work that I do.
Yeah.
I did notice somewhere around my mid-30s, maybe even early 30s, I noticed that there was a lot of people in Christian culture that were my age, that had grown up in the church, that were beginning to ask the same questions that I was.
Right.
And also similarly intimidated by what it would mean to say stuff out loud.
Right.
And so I just found myself being like, well, I'll go first. and so I started just sort of putting it out there to friends that I had, and discovering that so often I would say, I'm really wondering about this. And you just see this look of relief go over their face.
Yeah.
And they would be like, oh, thank you for saying that. I've wondered that too, you know?
Yeah.
And that is part of what motivated me to write the post and do it publicly too, is that I'm just like, I think there's a lot of people out there wanting to ask these questions, and they just need to see someone go first.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to do that. And it's not like I'm the first person to publicly ask these questions. Like, that's not, but I just mean within some of the circles that I run in, I was willing to sort of say like, hey, I'm thinking this. What do you think?
We've talked about apologists quite a bit. The other end of that spectrum is kind of the militant atheist side of things.
Sure.
And I'm very critical of the debate culture. Mm. And I think we've focused so much on the philosophical arguments that we've missed what I think you've just captured there, that just being honest.
Yeah.
Just saying, hey, I have these doubts. If more people were just honest like that, I think that would have this huge impact. And so you're right. You were taking a leap by being first, by coming out publicly in the circles that you run with. But I'm sure that that's going to have an impact on the people that you're friends with.
Well, it was sort of interesting, because I think when someone sort of deconstructs or deconverts, there typically is a bit of an angry phase.
Sure. Oh yeah.
And I think that that's pretty normal. So anyone that's listening to this, if that's where you're at, you're very much not alone.
Yeah.
But I also think that you don't have to live there forever. And so I went through that phase before I started speaking publicly, and it actually wasn't until I felt like I could address these issues without feeling angry that I felt ready to be public.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had already sort of gone through that phase largely. So when I started talking about it publicly, I felt like I'd gotten my feet under myself enough that I was like, I can have these conversations and not get super pissed off, mostly.
Right. Most of the time, yes.
Yeah. There's exceptions. But because of that, I had a lot of engagements with like both people on the atheistic side and people, on the Christian apologetic side, where I think I got into these conversations where people expected me to be pissed off and angry,
right,
and weren't entirely sure what to do when I wasn't.
Yeah, yes.
And, a number of my conversations with Christian apologists, for instance, I think there was an expectation ahead of the conversation that it might be somewhat adversarial, and then it just didn't materialize that way.
Yeah.
And I think it's been refreshing for me. I think it's for the people I've engaged with. There's a level of appreciation for that approach. And that's one of the things I love about how you're doing this. And even the title Graceful Atheist is it's saying something that I feel like is really important to say, because as much as our positions are important and our beliefs are important, I also just think our posture is really important too.
Right.
And how we relate to people and how we give people the benefit of the doubt and assume that their motivations are exactly what they say they are.
Right.
And that kind of stuff. And so for anyone who's listening that's going through this journey, like, it's okay to be angry. If you have spiritual, if you have some wounds that are coming as a result of your experiences with Christianity or any other religion, that's not uncommon.
Right.
But you do not have to let those wounds define you for the rest of your life. They can heal. You can find healing, and then you can look for what's good and true in life. And that journey is worth taking.
Absolutely. I'm still curious about the first people that you were telling. What was it like telling your dad? And I understand your wife's dad is also a pastor. So what was that like?
It was tough. To this day, the hardest part of this journey for me has been the knowledge that my parents worry about my soul.
Yeah.
And the idea that they might be afraid that I would go to hell. Like, if I was worried about that for my kids, I would have a hard time sleeping at night.
Right.
And so knowing that that my journey was basically putting them in a position where they might feel that way, that's tough.
Yeah.
I went through my rebellious teenage years where I was like, screw you guys. I don't feel that way anymore. I love my parents.
Right.
They're not perfect. They didn't do everything perfectly, but they loved me really well. And they still do. And so sometimes I'll publicly say, like, if you want to criticize the faith I come from, that's fine. I'm doing it. So, but if you want to criticize my parents, like, I'll come at you.
Absolutely.
Because I had some people saying, like, oh, obviously his parents didn't teach him good theology. And I'm just like, I just want to be like, you don't know the first thing about how I was raised.
Right.
So, like, that bothers me because I get defensive of my parents because I adore them.
Right.
So that's been tricky.
I think this is really, really, really important, what you just said. I've talked to a few apologists who are looking at deconversion specifically, and they'll have these lists of, causes from their perspective. And one of them they'll often talk about is, and I'm being unfair here, but they're basically attacking the way that you were raised or the way that you were taught Christianity, as if that's your fault anyway. But
right.
It seems also to me to be missing the point quite a bit, that then what is the perfect way to be raised?
Well, the insinuation there is that if my parents had just indoctrinated me properly, I would have stayed indoctrinated.
Exactly.
Like that's why I sort of have an issue with that whole line of thinking, because I'm like, look, I'm asking questions and I'm listening to answers from all kinds of people. I am interested in the truth. If Christianity is true, and if I'm genuinely interested in truth, then I'll end up there.
Right.
So you don't have to go after my upbringing. You don't have to go up after my parents. It's like, we're here now. Let's have a conversation about truth now.
Right.
Every time I talk to believers who try to convince me of the truth of Christianity, I generally point out, I'm like, you are believing first and rationalizing second.
Right.
I'm not saying that I'm not doing the same thing. I'm not saying I'm more objective than they are. But let's not pretend that this is exclusively like, through the powers of logic and reason, I am completely objectively looking at this stuff and I have objectively determined that it's true. It's like, that is not how this works.
Yeah.
And so I engage with Christian apologists a lot, and I very often say, like, we're looking at this issue. You're presupposing that it's true.
Right.
I don't feel like I'm presupposing that it's untrue, but I might be somewhat. So I have to grant that. And, it seems that the evidence is inconclusive because neither of us is drawing the same, we're not drawing the same conclusion here.
Right.
So what's different? Like, the facts are the same. What we're bringing to the table is different. And so that's why I think a lot of people's certainty on doctrinal issues or theology is a result of sort of an a priori interpretive framework for reality that they're sticking to.
Absolutely. And again, this is why I think that adult deconversions have so much to say in that I believed in the resurrection wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
I believed that Jesus was my savior. I believed with all of my heart, even with any doubts that I had. That was the core of everything. And then when I began to look for, I was haunted by the idea that I wanted this to be true. And so could I find an objective reason? And when I went down the road of looking for objective reasons, what I found was special pleading.
Yeah.
Overstating the evidence. I found bad arguments. And when I was just honest about that fact, the everything began to crumble, right? I was just recognizing that it's okay for me to believe this. It's not irrational for a person to believe this.
No.
But there isn't proof in any way. There is no objective reason to believe.
No, and that's one of the sort of the places that I've landed with regards to Christianity is I don't think it's unreasonable to be a Christian.
Right.
Even from getting to know, some of the apologists that we've been discussing, like, they're very sharp individuals and they've really thought about this. And it's not like they're being irrational for believing what they've believed. The only thing that's a little bit irrational to me is the certainty.
Yeah.
And one of the things I appreciate about Sean McDowell, for instance, is we had a conversation where we talked about certainty. And he said, I don't say that I'm certain about these things. I say that I have confidence. Meaning, I don't know that this is certain, but I see enough reason to believe it that I have some confidence in it. And it's been a good thing in my life. And when someone says that to me, I'm like, hey, fair enough. That's great.
Yeah. My response is, if you say you believe by faith, I respect that. I can't follow you there, but I respect it.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing because in my journey, I've sort of gotten to this place where I'm like, okay, at some point I'm going to have to embrace some mystery here. Mm-hmm. Because, if I'm going to be as objective as I can be, knowing that I can't be completely objective because I'm human, then there's just certain things I can't know. Like, I don't think that I can know what happens to me after death. I can have guesses, but I don't think I can know that. And this is one of the things that I think is a fair criticism of religion, is that, like, there are things you can reasonably believe, but then there's also things that are not reasonable to have certainty about. So,
right.
So, like, Christianity claims to know what happens after death, like most religions do.
Right.
I don't think that you can know that. And so that's an issue on which, like you said earlier, I think we're so uncomfortable with uncertainty that sometimes we invent our own certainty.
Yeah.
And to a large degree, I think that's what religion is. But religion also provides a way of looking at the world that adheres groups together in ways that evolutionarily we seem to have needed.
Right.
I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence that basically every society that has ever arisen out of humanity had a religion.
Right.
I don't think that's a coincidence. It serves a function. The question is, as we become more enlightened and more rational and more scientific, what do we do with those religions? You know, that and you know, we mentioned Nietzsche earlier, and I think when I was a believer, I always assumed Nietzsche was like, you know, he's quoted as saying, you know, God is dead and we have killed him. And when I thought about that as a Christian, I always thought he was like celebrating that, right?
Right.
But you read Nietzsche, and that is not the case.
Right.
You know, he's concerned about, we used to derive values from this shared fiction that we had. And now we're going into an era where we no longer, you know, share these religious beliefs. So how do we determine our values? And he hoped that someday we'd be able to determine our own values in a meaningful way. And he described those individuals as an Ubermensch or Superman, right?
Right.
And so he hoped that we'd be able to do that. And I think to a degree we have, but it's not at all clear that we've been able to do that on a societal level.
Right.
You know, and I think we see some of the effects of that today in the political landscape, you know, and
yes. And I find this quite ironic as well, in that I became a Christian in the late 80s. It was kind of the beginning of the moral majority, and the specter of postmodernism.
Yeah.
That was the thing that was the death of society. And what we're living through today, and I don't want to get too political here, but
no, sure.
That group of people has embraced nihilism entirely. Nothing matters. Nothing is true. Will to power is the only thing that matters.
Right.
And I just find the irony of the misunderstanding of the postmodernists who were saying, hey, given the fact that we can no longer accept these as absolute truths, now what do we do?
Right.
Which is the entire point of postmodernism.
Well, I think the postmodern question is a good question.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so much of the critique of postmodernism is not a critique of its truthfulness. It's a critique of its effects, right?
Yeah.
And so I share those concerns. Like I wonder what happens to a society when our whole legal system is based on, it's predicated on the idea that we have free will, which it's possible we don't.
Right. It's
predicated on the idea that human beings have intrinsic value. It's not easy to ground that claim in naturalism. So there are sort of religious ideas that we've built our society on that I think it's reasonable to be concerned that if you pull that particular Jenga block out of the bottom, can the thing stand up?
Yeah.
So I think there's some, like Jordan Peterson is a good example of someone who rails against postmodernism. And I think his concerns are totally justified. But it doesn't mean that postmodern thinkers are metaphysically wrong.
Right.
So it kind of comes back to like the way that applies to Christianity for me is like, I've had this thought, like I see Christianity as a good thing, or at least more good than bad in a lot of the lives of people that I care about. And so I go, okay, that doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
But what do you do with something that's good but not true?
Mm.
And I'm not saying that is even for sure exactly how it is. I'm just like, if that was
that's a good
case,
question. That's a great question.
So I've wrestled with that a lot.
Yeah.
My entire family and my wife's entire family, they're all Christian. They're all plugged into churches, and to detach themselves from Christianity would be to detach themselves from careers, from social circles, from their communities. it would be really disruptive to their lives. And I kind of go like, okay, so if I don't believe in this thing that they all believe, encouraging them to come over to my side, quote unquote,
Right.
like, what if that's really disruptive to their lives? And if that's the case, like, how do I relate to them?
Yeah.
And that's a tough question. I don't have good answers for that yet.
Two things I want to say in response.
Sure.
One, I've used the analogy of Dumbo and the magic feather, and I've specifically used it for my experience. Like right when I needed some support, feeling of somebody's got my back, somebody loves me, is when I became a Christian.
Yeah.
And then recognizing decades later that actually there was no magic in the feather, it was the people who loved me, that was the magic. The people were the magic. And the reason I bring that up is to say, I recognize that snatching the magic feather out of the people who are still believers, who we love, just leads to a crash, right? That there's no good in doing that. That's not going to help anybody.
Yeah.
And then two, everything I know about you thus far is that you're incredibly well read. I've got one more book recommendation for you.
Oh, please do. Yeah.
That is Jennifer Michael Hecht's Doubt a History.
Ooh, I'm going to write it down.
Early on in my deconversion, I read this book, and what it did for me was so important was just to ground that these questions are not new.
Yes.
So Cicero, the Roman philosopher, the Greek philosophers, the Epicureans, they were asking this exact question. We don't think there are gods, but if we took that away from the people, what would that do? What would happen?
Yeah.
This is an age-old question, and what I just personally derived a tremendous amount of comfort in knowing that humanity has been asking both the questions of the existence of supernatural and deities and what happens when you let go of that for thousands of years.
Yeah. In fact, I would actually say that in most religious texts, you see that.
Yeah.
So like the Bible, which is the one I'm the most familiar with, obviously, I heard someone say a few months ago, and this sort of blew my mind. So for your audience, when we were talking about the problem of evil, any attempt to sort of solve the problem of evil and talk about God in that way, it's known as a theodicy, and I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
But someone said at some point, the Bible is one big theodicy, and I thought about that, and I was like, that is true, because everyone that wrote the Bible, or everyone that wrote a part of the Bible, was wrestling with this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, look at the book of Job. I mean, that's like the ultimate.
Right.
Incidentally, that's probably the oldest book in the Bible.
Right.
And to think that the oldest writings we have in Christian or Jewish scripture is dealing directly with the problem of suffering.
Right.
I mean, that says something.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about that your career is in the Christian world, and you were definitely giving something up when you came out publicly about your lack of faith. I'm curious how your bandmates handled that. What was their response? And then is there a future for Hawk Nelson?
Good question. So I should give you a little bit of background. Basically, we were already as a band sort of phasing things out. And that's because right around when I became a father, I recognized that I had been touring full time for 15 plus years.
Right.
Everything that within Christian music, most of the things that you can do or accomplish or experience, we had done and accomplished and experienced. And so, you know, like I had kind of gotten the sense that like the best we could hope for is more of what we'd already done. Mm-hmm. And with the way that I'm wired, I'm so wired to seek out new experiences. So I was just like that, you know, like continuing to do the same thing the rest of my life does not sound awesome. Plus I just wanted to be home with my family, and you know, touring full time when you've got kids, that's just a tough life.
Sure.
So I had told the guys, you know, like this a few years, quite a few, you know, it was early 17. I think I told them this, 2017. And I said, hey, like, I'm not freaking out. I'm not quitting, but I want to transition my life away from music, and I'm fine for that to take a few years. I don't want to leave anyone, because I was the singer at this point, and
Right.
and we had already gone through one lead singer change, and we were not anxious to do that again.
Right.
And so we had already decided as a band to wind things down, and it was as we were winding things down gradually that I started to ask myself these questions about faith and God and stuff like that. And so by the time I started telling my bandmates about my doubts and stuff like that, we were already sort of winding things down. So it didn't feel like it had the same sort of like, oh shit.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Like it was sort of like, okay, like they were able to approach it from a more personal place, less of a concern on a band level and more just like we love each other as friends. Like,
Right.
not every band has that, by the way. Like,
I bet. Yeah.
There's plenty of bands where you see them on stage and you think they're all cool, but they walk off stage and they hate each other's guts. Like that is so common. Even in Christian music, that's common.
Well, it must be a very high pressure environment to work, right?
Yeah. I mean, it has its unique challenges for sure. So I know that, all the rest of the guys in the band are still believers. When I posted publicly, I told them that morning that I was going to, but I didn't really prepare them for the fact that I was going public. So they sort of quickly gathered together, with the band's manager and publicist and label and stuff like that. And they put a statement out, which was very, very kind. They actually sent it to me before they released it and asked if I was comfortable with it. And I was like, well, that's nice of you. I didn't do that for you. So, but yeah, so they were, super kind. I mean, to this day, we still have a Hawk Nelson text thread that's fairly active here and there intermittently. And we talk to each other and we love each other. And
good.
There was definitely no love lost there, but I don't see Hawk Nelson being active in the future.
Okay.
But the way we've sort of approached it is we never really did like a big goodbye announcement or a finale or anything like that. I like to joke around and say like, we're actually still a band. We just don't play shows or make music.
Yes.
So, but I think once I sort of came out as a non-believer, I think that probably effectively took that option off the table. So yeah, I doubt that we'll see any more music or shows from Hawk. Although life is weird, man.
Yeah.
So who knows? But I sort of doubt it. Yeah.
You can do a kind of a Dixie Chicks recovery from, they had the political statement way back in 2004 and they're back doing things, man. Yeah.
Yeah. They just needed some time. I guess.
So along these lines, and you've specifically said that they are all still believers. So I'm not talking about the band here, but you've mentioned that, you had friends and maybe other people in professional Christian world who have expressed doubts. I'm curious what their response was. Did it make them nervous at all that you came out about this publicly? Did they have to say, oh, that's great for you, but don't tell anything about me, that kind of thing? Did you have that response?
Well, within Christian music, there's always an understanding that there's things that are private. So, for instance, like for a long time, Christian artists didn't want people to know if they were okay with drinking, for example.
Right.
And I've never had a moral issue with alcohol. I've never thought it was wrong. Right. And I've always been comfortable with it. And I love ending the day with a beer. And that doesn't mean I'm getting wasted every night. It's like, I think you can be an adult about these things. And so, but the Christian music audience as a whole for a long time was very, very uncomfortable with the idea that the artist they listen to might be okay with alcohol. Right. So we'd be on tour and we'd, back on our bus after the show, I might go and have a beer on the bus. And we usually had a rule that like, once you've had a drink, you just stay on the bus. You just, you don't go back into the venue. You don't go talking to people. It's just, there's no reason to stir up issues. So just don't. But, other artists would come on the bus and we'd all have a drink together. And there's this sort of 90% of Christian artists are fine with alcohol. Sure. And so there's this sort of understanding that you just sort of like, you keep certain things quiet. Yeah. Not because they're wrong, but just because it's easier to just not go there. Right. So that understanding sort of is sort of a foundation of my relationships with all these other artists. And so if some of them, maybe identified with my journey a little bit, like it was always understood that that's a private conversation.
Yeah.
But I did. I mean, this was crazy. Like I had multiple Christian artists who I've known for years that once I came out publicly and said I didn't believe in God anymore, they, privately said to me, honestly, I haven't believed in years.
Wow.
And they're like, this is my career. I've spent my entire adult life building it, and I don't know how I would feed my family other than this.
Right.
And like, that is awful to me. And
yeah.
And, I know a few pastors who have similar feelings.
Right.
And I would imagine that among pastors that it's actually a lot more common than we think.
I absolutely agree with you. I think just generally people in the pews, there's a lot more doubt and lack of belief, but also pastors, leaders, Christian singers, what have you. I just think they get stuck, right? Especially if it's the way you feed your children, like you say.
Oh yeah. And like, especially if you have children, I know so many people that after high school sort of went to Bible college, and it's like it was a somewhat natural progression that maybe they didn't think about that much. And they're just like, oh, well, this is, I like my youth group. I like my young adults group. Maybe I'll go and be a pastor. And they became a youth pastor for a time. And then they get older and they become an associate pastor at a church. And then eventually, they become the lead pastor at a church. And, their life has taken this progression, and they find themselves eventually, in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they've pastored their whole lives. And suddenly they have this crisis of faith. And who are they supposed to talk to about it?
Right, exactly.
And so I just feel just tremendous empathy for these pastors and people that are visible Christian leaders who just, there's no way that they can explore their doubt without it threatening their livelihood.
Right.
So how are they supposed to? And I don't have a solution to that problem. I see the problem and I have tremendous empathy for it.
Yeah. Hey, maybe that's some work you can do.
I know. I would love, that's a really good idea. I would love to do that. I mean, I've had very prominent Christian artists call me and ask me to help them walk through a doubt issue.
Yeah.
It's really strange and also very like humbling. But you make a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Maybe I should more actively try to make myself available to those people. Not in a way to influence them any one way or another, just someone that they can talk to.
It's a soft landing.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that I've told my parents. Like, I'm actually not interested in pulling anyone away from Christianity.
Right.
What I'm interested in is pulling people away from feeling stuck if they feel stuck. Like, if you're someone who feels fulfilled and happy and in Christianity and doesn't want to leave, then great. Right. That's awesome. But there's a lot of people who don't feel like they have the capacity to ask the questions or the place to ask the questions that are in their heart. And I think that's toxic.
Right.
Unexplored doubt and questions, they linger, they fester, they become a source of real anxiety for people. And that's what I want to see people freed from. Right. I'm not trying to free people from religion. I'm trying to free people from unhealthy states. That's something I can spend my life on.
Hey, that's awesome. However I can support you, let me know.
Dude, that's what you're doing.
I'm trying, yeah.
Yeah.
I will just say, for the people that you do know that are pastors and maybe even singers as well, the Clergy Project, I highly recommend.
I've heard of this, yeah. I don't know as much. Maybe you could just explain it for a moment to both your audience and me.
Yeah. So, Linda Lascola and Daniel Dennett started this, and it was just that recognition that there are many, many pastors, lay leaders that are financially embedded in the Christian world in such a way that being honest about their doubt would break them financially. And so it is a private group where you can be a member. I'm not actually, so I don't actually know the details, but you can join this group and They do a little preview interview with you and get you some resources. And it's just a way that a person could express their doubt, or if they're on the other side of deconversion, just be honest, be authentic
That's amazing.
about themselves. So I highly recommend it. I love the work that they're doing there. But I really want to encourage you, John. I think you have a unique position to be able to do some of this work because people know you and trust you. And I think that's great. Which leads me to my last question, which is, what's next for John Steingard?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Well, it's been funny because I've been on a number of podcasts and, YouTube shows and stuff like that. And typically, it's a kind gesture that people like yourself do. Like, oh, what are you up to? What can we point people to? And very often it'll be, someone will say, oh, well, my new book is blah, blah, blah. Or I spent 15 years being like, oh, well, our new album is blah, 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 or our new single. But this last 6 months or so, when I appear on these shows, I haven't had anything to point to. I mean, right now I've been a little bit quieter than the last month or two. I've been a little bit more quiet online, partially because there's been a lot of really difficult tension here in the U.S. with regards to the election and COVID. So I've been trying to resist just giving my hot take on everything.
Yeah.
And not saying anything publicly unless I thought there was something really worth saying. But I have been working on sort of writing my journey and my story down. I've considered writing a book but I've also been aware that I was living it, so I didn't want to jump there too quickly. But, maybe 6 weeks ago, I started to get that feeling like I feel like I'm ready. So I'm actually about 75% of the way through writing a book that I don't know for sure will ever see the light of day. I mean, I'm definitely going to finish it. I'm aware that like its primary purpose has been for me to feel settled in what I believe now and what I'm sure about and what I'm not sure about. And there's a lot in that second category.
Yeah.
But I do think at some point it's very likely that I'll be putting that out.
Fantastic.
I think even once I finish it, even if it's not public yet or not public at all, I think even once I finish it, I'll want to pivot to talking to people more because I'll feel a little bit more gathered in my thoughts.
Yeah.
So I mean, if anyone's interested in, what I'm up to, Instagram and Twitter are the two best places for that. And in both those places, I'm just John Steingard, Jon, and then Steingard, John Steingard. And that's all I got right now, man.
All right. Yeah. We will have links in the show notes for sure. I think you also have a YouTube channel. Is that correct?
I do. Yeah. And I've flirted with off and on. I've flirted with putting more stuff there. That's something I'd like to do at some point as well.
Well, I for one will be buying any book that you produce. I think that there's probably a great appetite for that. So I hope you have very good luck on that.
Oh, thank you.
John, thank you so much for the vulnerability and the honesty and telling your story on the show.
Oh, thank you, David.
Final thoughts on the episode. Well, as you could hear, John is an amazing communicator and an amazing person. I cannot say enough about the humility and integrity and honesty in the way that John tells his story. We've talked a lot about high-profile deconversions and the reverberations within the Christian community that they cause. John's deconversion, and again, his humility and honesty in the way that he expresses it, will have long-lasting reverberations for quite some time. I'm amazed at the availability that he has given both to the apologists community and to the atheist and humanist community. John has just made himself available to tell his story. I'm excited for John to do his own project. As I mentioned, we recorded this episode about a month ago, but on January 1st, John began his own project called The Wonder and the Mystery of Being. And I will, for one, be a subscriber. I think John's perspective and process for seeking after truth is something that is worth listening to and emulating. I will have links in the show notes for John's projects, including the Instagram posts, the response to Brian Houston of Hillsong, his YouTube channel, the podcast, and various other links. I'll mention here as well that in the show notes, there are a number of quotes. John was eminently quotable, and so I couldn't help myself but write down quite a few of those. I want to thank John for being on the podcast and for telling his story and for making himself available. John, I wish you the best of luck with your project. I wanted to spend a little bit of time to talk about the plans for 2021. I made a plea in the December episode with my wife, Michelle, about an audio engineer. I want to first of all thank all the people in 2020 who helped me. Several people did the editing of their own podcasts. Jimmy, who did a Deconversion Anonymous episode. Colin did some story editing for me. John, early on in the year, did some editing for me. So there were several people who did editing, and I don't think I've thanked them enough. So thank you so much for that. For 2021, Mike T has joined. He's already done one episode for me. He's working on the next one, and we are building some rapport. The last part of 2020 was jam-packed with people who were interested in being on the podcasts, and I actually have a number of interviews already done. In fact, I'm backlogged, and that's why I have reached out for help. I'm looking forward to clearing that backlog and reaching out to some other humanists. There's been a number of new humanist podcasts that have popped up in the last year, and I'd like to reach out to them both to be on their podcasts and to have them on my podcast. If you are the podcast host of a humanist podcast, reach out to me, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, and I will have you on. I've also had other people reach out to me in how they can participate. There's a new site called Verbal, VURBL.com, and it allows you to do snippets. And what I'm interested in looking for people who are willing to create 30-second to 1 or 2 minute quotes of pieces of the podcast that are really easily shareable, that you could share with people to say, hey, this is what the podcast is like. I'm not on TikTok. I know that's a big thing there, but if you're on TikTok, maybe you could share something there as well. Copy editing would be another way that you could participate. And mostly the thing that everyone can do is just share the podcast with somebody that you know. My goals for the year are to improve the quality. I want to go from just simply editing to producing something. I want to have better audio quality, better transitions, more musical interludes, that kind of thing going into 2021. Now, you may not hear that in the first quarter or so, but that's my goal. I am using money that has been donated to the podcast to buy audio equipment here in the first quarter or so. So hopefully we'll begin to hear a bit of an improvement there as well. I can't believe that the podcast has been going for almost 2 years now, and I am very excited about the next year coming up. But I want to begin the year in gratitude again to you, the listener. There's no reason to do this work if you aren't there listening, so I appreciate you, and I thank you, and I hope that you keep listening. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. If you have audio engineering expertise and you'd be interested in participating in the Graceful Atheist podcast, get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.